Welcome to Anyhoney.
And the Newt. Welcome to another episode of Anyhoney and the Newt. We're glad to have you. Today's episode is certainly one that I'm fond, a topic I'm fond of talking about. But before we get into the meat of this episode, Anthony, tell me a little bit about advanced analytics. What are they, and how have they changed our understanding of professional basketball?
You said the meat, but I couldn't think of or the potatoes if you're vegan.
Fair point. Fair point.
Advanced, or is it a Beyond Burger?
Yeah.
That way you can have your meat and eat it too.
No, it's got to be the starch, nothing nutritious.
Yeah. That's 90% of Salia's diet, the starch. So the advanced analytics, it's really interesting. I had never really considered this stuff in my basketball fandom, probably until about like 15 years ago, I want to say, is when it seemed to start getting popular. And I hadn't been made aware of it until I started reading this blog called True Hoop, which eventually got bought by ESPN. And like everything on ESPN, once it becomes part of ESPN, it gets considerably worse. And then the founder of True Hoop spun off from ESPN and reestablished his blog as like a newsletter thing now. So promoting True Hoop for all you basketball nerds out there who want to just subscribe. They do like a weekly free thing, which is really good to read, and apparently all I have a capacity for. So but yeah, I remember in the early days, at least for me, I'm gonna say this from my perspective because I'm sure that I do not have the history mentally recorded, but in the beginning, when I first started reading about advanced metrics in basketball, the basic metrics being the counting stats, right? Points, rebounds, assists. At some point, plus or minus was considered like an advanced metric, but now NBA included it in their box score, so I would consider it kind of a counting stat, which is basically just a measure of the number of points that your team scores or loses while you're on the court, so I don't think it's a very fair stat. But so back in the day, plus and minus was one of the advanced metrics. I had also read some articles about people were looking at shooting percentages when you received a pass and how long after the pass your shooting percentage was. And one of my favorite articles that I remember reading a long time ago was trying to measure whether the hot hand was a real thing. And I'm pretty sure that the science around it went first it was yes, the hot hand exists. And now it's no, the hot hand does not exist. It's just kind of a phase, and I don't really remember the details one way or the other, but I remember articles coming out. This is 15 years ago, like I said, where the measurements were trying to judge what a person's field goal percentage was based on having made their previous shots, which is all actually really hard to do anyways, because we didn't have the camera tracking software that we do now. So that's another part of it, right? Was it, you want to say 10 years ago, the NBA started adding cameras to the court that tracked player movements? And maybe it's more recent than that. But I feel 10 years ago.
I think it's older.
Well,
I feel
I know that there were companies who were doing it, but the NBA didn't fully implement it until, I want to say it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, I don't remember. I feel like the Boston Celtics and maybe the Atlantic Hawks were early adopters of it.
Yeah, so some teams did have it because I remember the Mavs were an early rider for that, and then like you said, the Boston Celtics, the Philadelphia 76ers, who for all the griping that people gave Daryl Morey, he's not the right one, Sam Hinkie, about the trust the process Sixers. From what I've read, he was such an analytics snob that he tracked everything. He had people hired to track literally everything that every aspect of the team does, both during games and during practices. I remember reading about like tracking free throw percentages during practice, and players were getting pissed off about that because they're just like shooting around.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like I didn't venture too far into the advanced analytics, but as I started listening to podcasts that used them, I found it as an interesting way to make comparisons, especially beyond the superstars. I mean, often we would focus on the people that were scoring the most points or had the highest assists, and making comparisons of who's better and worse or whatever, just primarily on the raw counting numbers. But when we started talking about starters that aren't superstars or even bench players and trying to figure out who's a more valuable bench player than someone else, it got really difficult to make those comparisons. They play different amounts of minutes in different systems, different roles. And so I think the introduction of advanced analytics allowed us as fans to have something to grip onto. Even if we didn't do the analytics ourselves, it was introduced into conversations and articles and things like that. So now we can pay attention to more aspects of the game than we ever did before. At least it's helped me pay attention to things like picks, which I never would have thought. I know it's an important part of the game, but I wouldn't have thought of it as a statistic.
Yeah, I'll do you one better, which is that like, you see a lot of YouTube channels pop up that break down plays of the game. And I remember even pretty recently, like 5 to 10 years ago, the videos that would pop up were mostly from like a coaching perspective. Like people would bring these up as like training tips for how to like implement them in your game. But now those same videos, with the developed language around the advanced metrics, those same videos and style are being used to explain facets of the game that the average fan wouldn't notice, and then taking it within the concept of advanced metrics. So one thing I like about that too is it allows for both a more data-driven method while tying in the anecdotal evidence from it. It's like, here's a few plays that show exactly what we're articulating here. So that now there's not just the developed nomenclature around the play, but also putting it into action so that at least we as readers and fans kind of get that sense of developmental practice that is essential for incorporating that new language into your everyday language.
That's a really big point, because I think the debate about the eye test versus using metrics is really a tired debate. I feel like maybe initially there were some people that were numbers centric and focused purely on the stats, and other people who weren't familiar with those, and so just knew basketball and knew like they could identify talent even if they couldn't articulate why that person was more talented than someone else. But I think now the introduction of and the distribution of analytics across different media and different kinds of conversations means that we're applying it to the game. It's not something separate from the game, and the eye test, the enjoying someone's talent, isn't cheapened by also being able to talk about wins above replacement.
One thing that I've noticed is the rise of narrative for like developmental players, right? Every website now that's like deep into basketball will write like a know the prospect kind of story, where they do this very breakdown of a player in college or high school and why or why not that they will be successful at the NBA level. And here's a bunch of things that show like there is evidence that this player can do, this skill set, this skill set, this skill set. And there is evidence that they don't have these other skills, but taking all that into consideration, can they develop into the next LeBron James or Steph Curry or whatever? And, 20 years ago, there was like 2 websites that would produce content like this, but it was still very much I think he's going to be the next Tracy McGrady, end of story. There was no like evidence to display there. And part of that might be because fans just didn't have the language background to judge one way or the other, and that was all that there was, because that's what ESPN produced. But the other was that there just wasn't enough nuance around the topic to be able to to like, you could argue your way for it, but there wasn't enough nuance within the fan base to be able to say, oh, I either agree or disagree with your take. And maybe all that we could do is put it into those two bins. But now we're starting to see much more discussion around aspects of those articles instead of just a yes or no binary decision.
Yeah, and I think it's changed things for the players too. I can't remember which player I heard in an interview. I want to say it was Vince Carter, but somebody who was initially resistant to the idea of metrics joined a team where it was a heavy priority, and after like a half season, realized like, okay, coach has noticed that when I shoot from this spot on the floor versus this spot 3 feet over, I shoot 8% better on my jumper. And so I'm going to get to that spot. And that's a big part of my game now is no longer just shooting and practicing my shooting technique, but practice my movement and like how I steer defenders so that I can make my spot available to me. And so that transformed how they approached the game. The analytics didn't define their game, but it gave them a new way to think about what they needed to do to become better. And so I think that's interesting too.
That is really interesting. It makes me think of this terminology used in social media all the time, but actually applies to a lot of different facets, which is the concept of the influencer. And I wonder how important influencer is in the development of language. Because like if you don't have according to like influencer theory, which I'm totally just making up, if you don't have like a high profile person willing to buy into the usage of that, the tool that you just described in that case, how are you going to get it to adopt within other aspects? And we know right now that teams are very top down heavy. Players say this all across the board, like the superstar is the leader of the team. And, basically that person sets the tone, and we have to make sure that we all support what that person is trying to achieve. And what's interesting here is that team development, like every team has like their leader, right? But teams where they buy into that philosophy, or at least I should say, where they say that they buy into that philosophy, they do better. And teams where you can tell that it's more dysfunctional, seem to not do as well. But the reason why I bring up the influencer thing is like, and I think you're right, it was Vince Carter. So let's just, for the purposes of the rest of this conversation, assume it was. So if Vince Carter didn't buy into that, and this coach wasn't able to get anybody else at that level on board, would we be seeing, maybe it would have been slower to adopt, but would we be seeing players shooting only from set spots on the court? If you look at like shot charts, right, you see like the threes are most heavily in the very corner, and it's not even like stretched out a little along that line. It's like very concentrated in the corner. Then there's a gap until around the elbow of the 3-point line, and then another gap until around the top of the key, right? And so like if you don't have these like influencers to make that push, like, okay, I totally accept that my jump shot's better here and here as opposed to just willy-nilly anywhere around the 3-point arc. Would we have like people using it in other forms? Like would we actually have like this kind of analytics focused 3-point shooting that we have today?
And speaking of influence, I think we can segue into the topic for this episode, which is language. We've been discussing different aspects of subjective experience, perception, perspective, trying to understand what it's like to be an individual. And one of my favorite topics is language. What is it, and how does it impact the way that we think and operate? And what all does it entail? We're not going to get into all those details, but let's break it open. What interests you, Anthony, in the topic of language as it relates to experience?
Language as it relates to experience. I'm trying. I can't believe I'm blanking on this right now. But there's a movie that I find super funny, from like the mid '90s. And I'm gonna have to Google it because I just can't remember. But it's basically starring a guy who throughout the movie just like doesn't speak. He only speaks in like weird sound effects / noises and gibberish. And the context of like the way he says his gibberish, everybody in this movie world understands what he's saying. And so he's kind of like this like super celebrity. But like you as the audience just don't understand it. But the way they do it allows like what he's trying to communicate to be articulated so well that you do get the context and you do understand, which makes it really funny. And it's one of those movies where like it's very quotable, and there's just so many. It's bugging me. I'll try and look it up and bring it back later.
I am Groot.
I am Groot. It's not too different, except he does have multiple things that he says. Pootie Tang. That's what the movie's called. Have you ever seen it?
I haven't. No.
Oh man, it's if you are a fan of language, this movie will probably drive you bonkers, but also is absolutely absurd.
That sounds awesome.
But going back to your question about language and experience, first, how language even developed is like really interesting to me, and I obviously don't know the answer to that. But I can't think about how it's evolved, not just in the human realm, but throughout the hierarchy of life, right? We use this example of like a stomach not knowing or not experiencing digestion, right? But it does do its digestion process. So how do we get from a system like that with like single-celled organisms to a system as rich and complex as human language? And I've mentioned this earlier that I'm very much of the mind that our own being and existence isn't as special as we think it is, because you can see evidence of at least not the same level of complexity, or maybe there is some level of complexity within other species of animals. Talking whales, dolphins, dogs. If you're a dog lover, you might, maybe this is more personification, but you might notice these kinds of like nuanced behaviors within dogs that give you this idea like, crap, did you just understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, just a little interjection to piggyback off of that. I think historically, a lot of ink has been spilled on trying to identify what makes humans different from other kinds of creatures. And, early on it was the idea of a soul, but how is that different from animated animals? Then there was the idea, well, it's reason. But then we started seeing some of the problem-solving capabilities of animals. And so, we had to get more specific. And a popular one that I think still some people kind of latch onto is this idea that language makes us different. And I'm not convinced by that. I feel like you have to have a very narrow conception of language in order to think that. Partially because maybe when we say language, that's confusing to people. Maybe they think immediately of English, Chinese, French, and specific what we call natural languages that have developed sophisticated grammars and have a bunch of speakers. But I think if you break down what language is and what it's doing, things like gesturing. If American Sign Language is a language, then can't gestures and charades be linguistic communication? And grunts, like you were just talking about, Pootie Tang, making all kinds of noises can still be expressive and communicate something to an audience. And so I'm not sure that line between human communication, human language, and animal communication is really all that different.
Yeah, I mean, animals make gestures, but they also do communicate in other ways. I mean, whales are famous for their songs and their echolocation. We talked about bats in a previous episode, which is also fascinating because it brings about the perspective aspect of our existence as well. And all these conversations that we've had so far, we've only had the 3 on this topic area, is it just shows me how complex and intertwined all of these concepts are. I think, at least in our first season, the way we discussed this stuff was more discrete, right? Like a lot of the realms, they didn't overlap, although we were starting to tease out how much they did overlap. But this season, like all of these topics overlap so much. By the end of each episode, I definitely have a hard time segregating one idea from another.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of why we're fascinated to talk about this is that when you and I would have conversations about experience and learning and thinking and artificial intelligence and all these topics that we want to get to, we would get kind of bogged down on trying to parse out all these really fundamental concepts that are intertwined and are difficult to break apart, which is another aspect of what we want to talk about today, refining our concepts through terminology. But before we get there, I kind of want to push that back to the back first, and talk about if language is something that developed evolutionarily, which I think we both embrace. Let me just say this: we're gonna walk into a bunch of controversies, and I'm gonna stop trying to like give a bunch of caveats because I know enough to be dangerous and not enough to explicate everything. And so I'm just going to forgive anybody who's a specialist. I've studied some of that stuff. I enjoy it very much, but I have walked away from that realm. So I'm not up on the latest research. Please educate us in the comments. That caveat is going to be the caveat for the rest of the episode. So yeah, if we want to say that language evolved and it evolved through the phylogenetic kind of development of species, then what is it about human communication or language? How does human communication and language relate to human experience and thinking? Like, what's that relationship? Do we experience and then come up with a word for it, or does language precede the ability to experience something? Things like that.
Yeah, that is a great thing to ask, because I kept thinking about like what is the relationship between thought and language, but I think we kind of rolled back thought a lot to get to like experience as that like fundamental aspect of being.
Yeah, and I have a lot of personal biases to answer these questions, so I'm going to try and not strong arm the conversation. Just introduce one idea at a time and let you decide if you agree with it, want to challenge it, whatever.
Let's do it. I wish I had my challenge button so I can just burn.
Awesome. So I'm going to start by saying that I think that the ability to differentiate is basically the essence of what it is to conceptualize. So if you can discriminate between A and not A, and use behavior to make that discrimination, then you're operating at the very basic level of language, which I think that's a highly controversial statement, but for me, that's kind of what enables the structure for language at large. So if discernment is the basis of language and being able to express discernment, then we get into the issue of what we talked about last week, qualia and subjective experience. Like, if my experience is different than your experience, how do I know that what I name matches the thing that you name? And how do we know that our concepts are actually connecting to the same things in the world? So there's this question of, is language something separate from it and layered on top of the world? Do you have any initial thoughts on that?
My initial thought is that I mean, maybe this is going to get to where you're going, but that the language is there, at least in this particular form, to help us. I mean, maybe it is to provide that qualia, right? Like, if we both gestured at something, you, even if we have no spoken language, I could point at like a tree, and you know that I'm talking about that tree because I pointed to it. So now you have like a frame of reference there. If I just,
I love that you use that example.
Good. It shows that we're on the same wavelength. And for all the podcast listeners, Corbin and I do communicate through telepathy all the time.
I just quickly want to interject, and then I'll let you go on with your example. But Wittgenstein raises this problem or this question: when somebody raises their arm and sticks out their finger, how do we know to look in the direction of their finger instead of their shoulder? Right? It's a line segment, and there's two ends to that segment. So how do we all know which direction to avert our eyes to identify what's being pointed out?
Damn. Oh my goodness. You just blew my mind with that question. It's such a simple, stupid question that I had never thought about. But now all of a sudden I'm like, do humans just have some fundamental understanding of vector mathematics just like built within us? Because I've always thought about the development of math as a language, but it's also a tool and it's also a system. And I'm already breaking down. Let's just move past this. But that is a really interesting point that like we just somehow instinctively know. But I wonder if that was like the very first caveman to point. Everybody else just looked behind him.
I'm gonna just suggest, instead of trying to argue for it, because I think we do want to move on. I think that there's a lot that has to do with social enculturation. I think it might be a learned behavior that we developed over time, and there's something about the codification of language, right? It's not just I'm making up words as I experience things in order to differentiate them from other things. Those sounds and those written symbols have to be codified enough that somebody else can see a repetition or a pattern to be able to understand how they're connected to the thing that they're distinguishing.
Yeah, and I'll add to that with it's easy to think about like the first time a human has ever said or done something, but we forget constantly that our prior form in evolution had some basis in language as well, right? So like you said, it's a learned behavior, but this is over like literally billions of years, and not just when the first, as we define human, popped up, right? Like our primate ancestors will probably had some form of like pointing communication. We already know that like chimpanzees make tools and stuff like that. So why wouldn't there also be other language development within that, right? So like the first human to point wasn't just developing a whole new method. That behavior and that structure existed well beyond that person.
And you mentioned like maybe humans have an innate ability for vector mathematics or whatever, but a common linguistic thesis is the idea of generative grammar. That despite the variety of natural languages, there's something hardwired into the brain, the physiology of the human brain, that that I don't want to say predetermines, but predisposes maybe the ways that we structure and interpret our world. And so even though there's a lot of variety among the different languages, there are some things that seem to be consistent. The differentiating of things into objects instead of processes. So you have nouns, the ability to distinguish different types of action from different states of being. So being verbs versus action verbs. Some of these like very generic grammatic concepts, some would argue is physiologically hardwired into us. I don't know if I buy that, but I wanted to throw that out there because I think that's at least touching on some of the stuff that you were indicating.
That's interesting because I just kept thinking about how much our body language plays into the context of the word. Sometimes you hear like a new word, and if it's similar enough to a word that you already know, and the body language is all there, you can kind of get a sense in what the other person is trying to communicate. Sometimes a word is so foreign that you just don't get it at all. So maybe we table this for a little bit later, but what you mentioned just made me think about those two examples.
Yeah. Let me wade into another. I'm just kind of like throwing these out here, and we can stop at any moment on a topic you want to engage in. But
the spaghetti method.
I think right. And a lot of it, I think, is going to stick to the wall, and we'll be coming back to these topics over and over again. So maybe it's good to just get them out there. Let me wade into the Sapir-Whorf controversy. So this is it became popularized. I can't remember how it got into pop culture, but it was a theory that was developed by Benjamin Whorf's student, Sapir, or do I have that backwards? And somehow it got attached to both of them, even though the student's the one that really popularized the theory. And it's the idea that our ability to think of concepts is determined by our language. So if we don't have a concept for it, we can't think it. We put that object or concept or experience into another concept. And so something like one of the examples would be if you have a language that has the numbers 1 and 2, and then anything higher than 2 is just called some, right? And then how do you distinguish between 4 and 5? If you've got two piles of rocks, you say, well, there's some and there's some. Maybe that sum is more than that sum, but how much more? Well, that one's easy because it's 1, right? But what if it's a pile of 7 and 10? Well, now we've got some, more some, and what's the difference between them? Some. And so you have a lot of difficulty in developing any kind of mathematics or complex mathematics with that kind of communication and discernment.
That's that's really funny. It reminds me of I had just learned about this just a couple weeks ago, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But the concept of ethnomathematics is a new thing that's being studied in the education culture realm. And basically, what the research field is all about is trying to understand how big a role culture and language play in the learning and understanding and articulation of mathematical concepts. And I'm pretty sure I read recently that it applies also to science. But I'm gonna steer clear of exactly what you just warned about, which is that it's not that like if you don't have that language in your culture, you just can't understand it. But it's more like it's harder for you to grasp and develop the tools if you don't have that language, if you don't have the language around it. But we've kind of just demonstrated that we have some of these things. I'll use the word innate because I don't know if it's hardwired or learned or whatever. But there's something inside of us that allows us to continue to develop this context and language. And really, a lot of the times, all it takes is for you to be able to develop the experience with it, right? So when we talk about language, right, we're developing our experience with the language. And a lot of times in the way that I do things at work, right, I'm trying to build people's experience with a topic. And so we actually purposefully don't use language in the beginning because we want the experience to take hold first, and then we introduce, at least from the English language and sometimes in Spanish, we'll introduce the language so that then there's an assignment of like, okay, this thing that I was doing is called this, and not like this is what it's called and here's the definition of it and now you're going to do this. And so this allows people to kind of help develop their own experience and meaning, and then we can start to apply it in different ways and show like, well, professionals do it this way and this other group over here does it that way, and in your culture you might do something like this, and there's no real wrong way of going about the process in that way.
That's a really good point, Anthony. And I like how careful and nuanced you were with how you phrase that, because that is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, as some of the crazy claims that I think are made with this relationship of language to thinking. I'm going to give an example that I think was popularized, and I'm pretty sure it's been debunked, but I can't give you the specifics about the science or anything. So I'm going to be careful about going into too much detail. But it was this idea that there was a claim being made that the Native Americans couldn't see the colonial ships coming to the coastline because they didn't have the terminology of that kind of naval craft. And so their inability to name something like that and to have a concept for it meant that physiologically they also couldn't perceive it. And so they're looking out across the sea and they don't see these boats coming in to invade their land, which to me, I mean, I think it's actually been debunked, but that also just seems like a really strong claim that I think we would need a lot of explanation of how something conceptual can change our physiology like that.
I can't help but think of your earlier example of somebody like pointing at the ships. And then everybody else simultaneously not knowing what that means and looking behind the guy as they look in the direction of his shoulder or her shoulder.
Right, right. So I think we have a lot more to say about this. I kind of knew that we would, and so this seems like a good breaking point. Let's set aside the extreme versions of this theory, and we'll come back next episode and talk about more nuanced, I think, more reasonable approaches to the relationship of language and thinking.